How you doing, man?
I am doing great.
I just reviewed our podcast from last week, and I was reminded of the view transitions thing. It was pretty neat. You still got to get that thing published so we can all see it because I really want to see how it works.
Yeah, just on that, Astro yesterday published the MPA, the multi-page app view transitions demo. So it's a site they build with Astro, but it's not JavaScript. It's on SPA, and yeah, it's just a CSS property you shove up at the top of your CSS file, and you get cross-page animations. It's really cool. Well, I'll link to like the tweet that they sent out because it's got like
Yeah,
a
that's a good.
little video, but
Yep.
yeah, and I heard that Safari did announce that their next version of Safari will have view transitions. So
Oh, cool.
it sounds like this is moving fast because
Wow.
when I started this, what was it, like 3-4 weeks ago?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had no idea. It felt like I was like doing like a
In
fringe
Chrome.
API.
Yeah. And now it's default in Chrome. I saw that tweet as well.
That's the MPA one. So the MPA
Right.
one is default. The SPA one, the one that we talked about last week, you don't have to change any settings or anything in Chrome.
Ah, I see. I see. Got you. So that needs to be something that the browser's like enabled by or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas you're okay, but the support is still the same. But the support for what we talked about last week with start view transition in JavaScript, that's what's
Yeah.
coming to Safari.
Yeah, I don't know. So all I saw is view transitions are coming to Safari. So I don't know if it's the SPA start view transition API or it's both the SPA and MPA navigation API.
Gotcha.
Navigation API
Cool.
is the wrong way to say it. The view transitions that work in an MPA app.
Right. I saw exactly the tweet that you're talking about on Twitter on my phone. And I opened it. It was nice. I had a video of it working perfectly in a very like immaculate test
Yes.
environment. And then I was like, I don't even want to open this on my phone because I know exactly what's going to happen, but just for fun. So I clicked on it, and of course, it's kind of like silly. It's a silly mobile demo. It's like responsive, but the view transition doesn't make any sense.
Wait,
And moreover,
did it work?
it
on
does
your phone?
transition on the phone, but it does kind of like a weird crossfade because like the responsive design is basically only big enough to show one movie poster on like your screen. So you kind of scroll down and then like you click on Leonardo DiCaprio or whatever, and then
Wait,
like it just kind of stays there.
wait. We might be talking about a different demo. This demo is like it's like a music
Mo-
player.
Oh, I saw Astro movies. This was from the Astro account. It was movies, and you click on actors and movie posters.
That might be a different one. Okay, this is so confused. This is so confused. Well, I will check after.
By
But
the
I
way,
think this is like
we don't prepare for this
yeah.
podcast.
Can you tell? This one was like a Spotify music player, and
Oh, I didn't see that.
my browser wasn't updated, so I didn't have like MPA view transitions, and so
I see.
It worked just like a regular web app.
I see.
Yeah, we'll take a look. We'll take a look at that.
Yeah, we'll take a
after the
look
pod.
for sure. But yeah, there was this demo that was going around about the movies, and it actually was working in. I guess maybe that's why it wasn't because it's not support there. But the first thing I checked, this is the only other point I want to make. That we can actually get to the meat of this one.
Mhm.
The only other point I wanted to make was the first thing I tried was swiping back. Because this is something that has like plagued us SPA developers for a while, and honestly, it messes up a lot of interactions on the web, even on like Apple's website. It's very hard to get this right because you're trying to reveal the cache. It's like it's just a was it LRU cache or whatever basically, and you just have like the pages, your history stack, and you should be able to swipe back and see it. But if you use JavaScript to render, it doesn't work a lot. So I wanted to see what the animation did with that. And it was just kind of finicky. It was like you saw the last page, but the picture wasn't there. It was hidden. And I was trying to think if it's because of, you faded it out and then it kind of appears once it settles.
Interesting. I'm surprised that it like anything with view transitions even worked in mobile Safari. But I don't.
So
don't know.
maybe, yeah, I'll have to
Maybe
look.
it's something else.
But that's kind of a follow-up question I have to last week's, which is how are they going to handle back button navigation with something like the swipe back feature on the iPhone? Have they thought about that? Is there a way to interop with that in a way that you could like opt out of a view transition. Usually you'd want to opt out of a view transition in that case. So you want it if you tap back, right? But if you swipe back, and maybe that's just an API that needs to come to Safari, mobile Safari, because it's just different and unique to the browser. But
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what they do.
yeah. Cool.
I'd also love just to wrap that. I also love some like recommendations on like, obviously if I'm like clicking links, I want animation, but like when I'm hitting back, like what
Maybe
is
you
the best
don't.
practice there? I don't want animation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I feel. I always feel like that is true. I feel like, even websites, I even appreciate websites that do this where when you go to the homepage and they like animate their logo and you start clicking around, they don't. But like if you refresh on any of the pages, they do. So they only do it once. I thought that was a nice detail and a considerate detail.
Cool.
It's really cool to see the logo, like the animation the first time you see it. You don't need to see it every
See it
other
every
time and when
single
you're
time,
hitting
yeah.
back. So
I posted a poll on Twitter that was like, you hit the back button. A website has animations and view transitions. You hit the back button. What should happen? And it was, show animation, use the animations back to the original state or just no animations. And the results were like 50-50 between
Oh,
those two.
perfect.
So yeah, I was like, great. I have no idea what to do.
yeah. Cool. Lots more to think. Lots more I thought as I was working that podcast too. Just like writing the notes up for it. One of the first things was like back to the cancellation discussion we had.
Yeah.
If you wanted to build something like a cancelable animation, like in iOS, when you start flicking an app, they always show that you can like grab it again. So still haven't had time to play with that because I was in Big Sky, Montana last week, which is what we're going to talk about next. So I went to Montana, met a bunch of cool folks, and had a great time. I gave a talk about, it's called High Floor, High Ceiling, and we want to kind of talk about that. But first, I want to talk about Ryan Florence's talk, which was called Mind the Gap. And our talks kind of had a nice little, they kind of complemented each other. And we have been talking a little bit about some of the conversation on Twitter the last few weeks about front-end frameworks and back-end frameworks and thinking about details of UI versus the cost of building those things. And it was really, even though some of the people on Twitter have been there's been some adversarial kind of conversation, there's also been a lot of good conversation, I think, on this topic. And I felt like Ryan did a really good job of kind of like capturing the most important parts of the talk. And ultimately ended with a demo of React 19 use server and use client stuff in a way that I felt was very more clear and a more practical example than I had seen in a lot of the talks that we've seen, or even just a discussion around things like server components and
Cool.
server actions.
Could
So I
you
wanted to
talk
talk about
about-
his talk, and then I wanted to talk about my talk afterwards. So
Cool. I'd love to hear about this. I haven't seen his talk, so I'd love to hear about the demo too.
cool. So his talk is called Mind the Gap, and the setup is ultimately it is kind of feeding to a demo of server components and server actions. And obviously you've built like a server component framework, so you know the ins and outs of how they work. So the demo is nothing like spectacular, but the setup I think is great because the setup is all about how whenever we make a decision in a product, there's some cost associated with it. There's a technical cost. And if you're deciding what to build next, you're an entrepreneur, you're making an app or whatever, you are going to evaluate the benefit of feature X, and you have to estimate the cost. And let's just say, like, take the estimates out of it for now, and you just know the future, which is kind of the whole point. But let's just remove that for the sake of simplicity. So let's say that if you added some feature, let's get practical, like you add, like a message inbox to twitter.com where people can DM each other, and it's going to bring you X more dollars. There's a cost to building that, having it on every page, blah, blah, blah. And he starts off this example with the border radius, where he talks about, let's say you wanted to add a border radius to your design, right? And you wanted to round the corners in your web page in like 2002. Well, you had to bring in like all these GIFs for like the corners. Me and Ryan are old, but for those of you listening who aren't, that's how you had to do it. There used to not be a border radius CSS property. And so people would do all sorts of hacks to actually create a border radius, appearance of a border radius in their HTML.
Can I just interject here for a second? You say bring in these GIFs to do it. It is so much harder than that because you have to open Photoshop and then you're in Photoshop trying to draw the thing. It was so hard. But when you got it working, it was just so satisfying. Anyway,
Exactly. And so he shows this code on the screen that's like a table because he also had to use table for layouts. So you had to position them in a way that like put the top left dot space or GIF or like the top left GIF, maybe it was a sprite or something, in the right part of the table layout. Anyways, it was ridiculous, right? And so why did they want to do that? Well, maybe they wanted to add rounded borders. Maybe they had an aesthetic that was going to make them money or whatever. So a lot of the conversation about Twitter was like, it's not worth it to do all this fancy stuff. Anyways, he kind of sets that aside. He just says, every time we do something, there's a cost, there's a benefit. The benefit could be to you because you want to do it. The benefit could be because you think it's going to help set your app apart and draw more customers because of a nice UX or UI, right? That's kind of how he's framing the problem. And so he says, back then we had to do, the cost was high. The technical cost was very high for rounded corners. And there's also like the unknowns of like, what if you have like a rounded corner panel in a rounded corner panel? What if you change the background color? Blah, blah, blah. It's like the technical cost was like huge, right? And he says like, well, every so often, like we can actually lower the technical cost of implementing a product or a feature or pulling off some user interaction, right? And you can basically make it go to zero. And so he shows border radius, the CSS property. And once you get that, at that point, whether to add rounded corners to your app basically is just the product question, whether you want it or not. Because now there is no cost effectively, right? And he was kind of like, that's what we're all trying to do. We're all of us, the framework authors, the people who are making tools and not apps, like the people who are working on the tools that we use to make apps, ultimately us trying to find better abstractions. I mean, it's a lot of what we do, right? We have recipes on Build UI teaching people how to do things, and we're trying to lower the cost if you want a resizable panel or an animated carousel, right? A nice switch or whatever. That lowers the cost of having something like that in your app. And that's kind of what was his setup. So that makes sense, right?
yeah, it's also just great framing because different people have different values and it lets you select your values without getting dogmatic about you're wrong, my side's right, your side's wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. There's backend tools, and this is kind of how it feeds into my talk, but there's backend tools that have kind of like you were saying this one time where they have, Rails has a really nice abstraction for WebSockets, which is kind of interesting because it's more of a backend framework or, you know, uh, and that's because they want to lower the cost of like adding real-time stuff to a Rails app, which is hard because you're not sitting in a React app, right? Point being, it was a nice setup because a lot of that discourse in Twitter over that last month or so was about all sorts of things. And this is really just like, okay, it's not about whether we both want to add, something to our app that's like an instant drop down, like the Hey calendar example or not. It's just about, we should all be able to agree that technology improvements that reduce the cost of building features should be great. Everyone should be welcome. That should be welcome to everyone
Right,
else.
right.
It's like all else equal, building product X, if product X is 10 times cheaper because of technology or AI or whatever, like that should be an easy thing to agree upon, right?
We can all agree that once border radius comes to CSS, there's absolutely no benefit to doing the images with tables. And yes,
Exactly. Exactly. So then he talks about, he kind of goes on the middle section of the talk is kind of how we have front end frameworks and back end frameworks and how they back end frameworks started in the server and are kind of moving towards the front-end frameworks start in the front end because they wanted to care about like tools dedicated for UI building, and they've been trying to fill in the back. And there's things like inertia JS that try to cover the middle and let you use the backend framework for what's good at the backend and the front end framework for what's good at the front end. You've got backend specific tools like Phoenix Live View that lets you update the DOM from Elixir. And then, you've got like server rendering of React components or whatever. And he's like, the backend stuff is good at the backend, the front end stuff's good at the front end, but the network is kind of where all the productivity gets lost. Those are actually my words because that's how I thought about it in the context of my talk after I was watching this. And it's true. Like, you're writing a Rails app. We're working on a Rails app right now in consulting. And when you're in the happy Rails places, it's just everything just flows out of you like writing poetry. And as soon as you leave it, like even if you have to go to like, even when you go to pass controller data and render in the front end and you're making partials and stuff, it's harder than making Ruby classes and using all the APIs that are in Ruby and Rails because you're going over the network and you're serializing data. And you can't just loop over something because maybe you're going to make an N+1 request. And all of these things have to do with the fact that you're still building two apps, which is something we talked a lot about when we used to do SPAs, where it's literally like two repos. But the reality is you're always building two apps the second you have any sort of like interaction, whether it's even filling out a form, right, on the front end or not. You're always building two apps. So he's like the network. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you're building one app, but it's running in two environments. That's
a good distinction because that's very different than what we were doing, which is literally building and deploying two apps. One of the things that we love about server frameworks like Rails is that conceptually it's designed for a developer or a small team to build a single app, and it feels and looks like a single app. But it's still true that the network is where, like this is his words in the talk. He says the network's where the party's at, because we're all in here just making a mess of all sorts of stuff, right?
Yeah.
You got turbo links, and then now you got turbo and stimulus, right? Again, that's where you leave the happy land of, but you have to because you're up there. And then same with the React stuff. If you're going to build an API, and you're like you just are gonna like pull out the rope, and start because you don't want to build a whole API, a general API, and you're doing stuff with authentication, whatever. So that was kind of the middle part of his talk about how there's lots of different ways that all the communities are solving this problem, but it's really the network which is the crux of this. And like, he also has this other part in the very beginning, which is like maybe Live View and Phoenix because of the way Erlang is designed and it can handle so many connections. It's just so freaking fast. I've seen some like crazy demos with Live View, where it's like drawing things at like 30 frames a second across the network or whatever. I don't know how it does it, but it's pretty crazy. And there's like video games that, I also thought about this. Have you ever heard about this? It's services where you sign up to play like a PlayStation or like a souped up computer and you're just streaming the result,
Yeah.
So that's kind of the logical conclusion of like, well, that lets you stay in the Phoenix happy land and you never have to even think about it because you're literally, that's one way to solve it is basically just not worry about the network if you have something that's fast enough. But then he calls out this thing, and I really like this term that he kind of coined, I believe, because I hadn't heard it, which was like a network-sensitive interaction. And this was the drop down in the calendar example, or the drag and drop in the Hey Calendar example that was going around Twitter while everyone was talking about this. And so network-sensitive interaction is an interaction that basically feels broken if it is blocked by a network. So it's okay to click a link and wait. That's not a network sensitive interaction because our expectations about navigating and loading data. But if you saw a select and you clicked on it to open up a menu, like a menu in like a native app, and it didn't do anything. Or you drag it, you grab an event on a calendar and you drag it and you let go, and then it goes back and then it updates. Or you click a drop down and it takes a second. It violates our expectations as users in ways that don't feel great. And he called these network sensitive interactions. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
And so he basically talks about if you have any of these in your app, which again most of us do, and most of us here, if you care about this sort of thing and wanting to make UIs that can feel instant, even if things are happening, or just respond to any event other than a form submission or navigation, then you're going to have some of these in your app. And so you're going to basically, if you want anything like this, like liking a tweet on Twitter, if you don't want that to be blocked by all one or all the other, the network is still going to be part of your architecture, right? That's kind of the point of this section. We're all doing things, and like basically the network is just a fundamental part of our apps.
Interesting. So basically, if you have these network sensitive interactions, that's going to, when you're writing your app, you're either going to have to think about either side of the network. So if you don't care about the latency, and I'm, by the way, like you might not, like I think it's fine if you don't.
Totally.
Then any interaction could be blocked by the network, but that's okay because you just get to stay on the server. You don't have to think about either side. But if you do have these interactions and they do bother you, then an example of like liking a tweet, now you're going to have like client side code that switches the heart to filled in, as well as send off the network request at the same time, basically an optimistic update. So that's really, okay, that is really cool.
Yes, and it is the network sensitive interactions that make the network a necessary thing that you have to consider while building the app. Whereas, and again, it's network sensitive. It's not fast, right? Because if you were building a Phoenix app that was only server rendered, like a rich application with all this functionality, but you never do anything other than click links and to submit forms and press buttons in the client, and all of those are handled by the backend. Your backend can be slow because you have a slow database query, right? That's not what this is about. You would fix that database query. It's just the network. It's just the latency due to the network that can make certain certain interactions that are sensitive to more than a 50 millisecond delay or a 25, right? That's kind of what he's talking about. So basically, at the end of the day, point being, the network is something that usually for a lot of people matters, and they have to think about it, which is why people choose to do things in JavaScript or choose to use something like Stimulus, right? Things that you need beyond HTML and CSS to do, whether you're in a server or client framework. So that's the setup. And he goes through all these different things about all the different solutions that different communities have come up with, and then he talks about React. And he has like a 3-part grid, which is like server, network, client, and he has all of the different things on there like coming across, and then he like fades in React and they all fade out, but the boundaries fade out too. And he's like, React 19 is solving this by basically trying to abstract the network away from the app, from the developer experience. And so then he goes to the demo, which is a table that starts out being rendered in a server component, and it's just completely server rendered HTML, you can think of it as. And then he brings in a sortable table, and it's the same table, but now he can click on the headers. And he just does that by changing a component from table to sortable table. And he's like, wasn't that amazing? And he's like, no. Like, we've been doing this in React for 10 years. What did you just show me? You can make a table where you can click a header and like, set some state or something. But let me show you what happened, because we just went from a server rendered app to the sortable table, which took the same data as props. It's the same thing. I just changed the import. But now if we look at the network tab, we have a script that we're shipping to the client. We have data being passed from a server to a client, to our client app, and we have the client component being stateful. And all I had to do was press use client. I didn't have to think, how am I going to get data from my server, which is currently rendering all of this, to the client? How am I going to like get the client code that needs to load and run on the client in the first place? How am I going to just integrate these two things? Which was that last slide that had like a million things going on it. He's like, he opened the sortable table and he's like, this is it, use client. And he was like, this is our border radius for the network. It was like, boom. It was an awesome moment. He did such a good job teeing up. I was like getting so excited in the audience. I thought it was really good.
Awesome. Awesome. Dude, when you give that example, if you built a server rendered table and then I tell you to go build a server rendered table, and then a week later I'm like, hey, we need client side sorting. There's a lot of technical decisions you have to make. You might set up an API endpoint to fetch all the records as JSON and get them into some front end sortable library. Yeah, it's
A
hard.
lot,
And,
a
yeah,
lot. API decisions, or you're going to use something like that. Again, this is kind, and this goes to my talk, which maybe we'll talk about next week, honestly, because there's just a lot I'm still been processing about all this. It's really exciting to me. But the ceiling, it's like you want to make it sortable. Sortable tables is not something HTML and CSS can do, right? Maybe there's something I don't know. There's
yeah. But let's
CSS
just say
people
no, yeah.
who know how to do crazy things with
Yeah.
tables. But let's just say that there's no way to do it, right? Most people don't know how to do it. So then, like you said, you make an API endpoint and do that, or you can use one of these other things like in his graph that are kind of pushing the server more to be able to cover a higher ceiling of UI cases, like like an HTMX or
Yeah.
a live wire, and you can say like on click, but then you have to bring that in. And you still have to think about it. I like what you're saying, because like if this is the reality, is that you don't know what you're building up front. This is actually like an important part, I think, that like he didn't really talk about, is what you said, which is like your boss asks you to build a table and then comes back with a change. That's like kind of what all this is about, right? Because we can all say you should just use the right tool for the job,
Yeah.
but you don't know what the job is. Like the job changes, you know what I mean? And like when you and I were at TED, something
Yeah,
that really
it's
stuck
so
out.
true. It's so true. Yeah. Use the right tool for the job. It's such a lazy thinking, because in the sense, it's a way to fight. Use the right tool for the job is a way to fight the Yagni. I guess Yagni is use the right tool for the job, but use the right tool for the job is a way to fight the let's over engineer everything because
Yes.
we might need it one day. And
Yeah,
so,
premature whatever optimization, or just Yagni,
yeah.
right?
But being charitable to like use the right tool for the job is almost like an insult. Like, why did you choose this tech? You should have done it in this tech. But yeah, exactly. Being charitable to why people choose tech. Yeah.
Right. So I think your point is great, because your boss asks you to build a table, and then in a week you build a sortable table. You use the right tool for the job last week, but now you have, like you said, a lot of decisions to make. And something that stuck out to me when we worked together at TED, when I first started there, you'd been there for a little bit, and we were working on these Ember apps, and we kind of went through this process where people did ask us to do things, and we would try to figure out what the right way to solve them is. And one time we made an Ember app out of like a Rails app. We had made like an Ember front end using some new components. And the only thing that changed was this woman at the conference, one of our colleagues who was flipping through all these contacts, could click on a contact. It was a master detail view. It was like literally like a port of a Rails app into Ember. But because it was master detail, when she selected a thing and saw the detail, like the sidebar stayed scrolled, like it would an iPad app or something, or a Mac app. And she was like, oh my gosh. She was like blown away by how useful, like that alone. So that goes to the point of like, well, use the right tool for the job. Sometimes the ceiling, like sometimes these higher area rich UIs are actually like more beneficial. Like the benefit is worth a lot more. And you see that, and then you're like, in your mind, sometimes you're like, there's a way we can solve this problem better than you thought, which was to like reorient the whole screen so that you can keep track, right? And but there's a cost, but the benefit could be right. So that's just all that to say that, like, I think a lot of what got lost in the conversation when everyone's coming from their own tribes or whatever is like a lot of this stuff is discovery. And if you can come up with a border radius that gets standardized and added to HTML, you're giving app developers and product people and entrepreneurs the ability to try out this thing, to try this out and experiment and find out what works. And if it took a lot of a higher cost to try out rounded corners or shadows or, clicking a tweet and having it instantly respond or having an animation that's interruptible, the lower cost you can make all that stuff, the more people can try it out and see if it actually solves their users' problem. So, and then on the back end, there's things like that too. What if we could just have history and rollback of all of our data because of some back end technology or way to store data that gives our users access to that, right? That's a huge cost, but there's definitely been technological advancements that have made it a lot lower,
Yeah. I want to push back on this a little because I think I kind of relate to like the back end crowd in this. And well, I guess a lot of the times where I've seen like this frustration come up, and it's definitely been like back end developers talking to front end developers, is that like, yeah, it's great that we can like experiment and find the way to do border radius, but like, please don't do it in the app that we're building because like we don't want to be on the bleeding edge. We don't want to experiment. And I think that's where a lot of like, I think that's where a lot of this
the frustration from the other side
comes from.
Yes.
Yeah. We don't need React. We're trying to build a web app that can update a database. And we're sick of front end developers just bringing in React and making a mess. And
yes,
and again, this it's not always like the most charitable
right
argument, but I do think that like there are some apps out there that do want to like push everything forward, and they know that they're like trying to find the next border radius, and they are trying to push the web forward. But I don't know that like necessarily every app.
No, of course not. These are two different conversations, which is why I like the way that Ryan set it up, because he said you have a product benefit and a technical cost. And at the end of the day, it's not even just front end developers. Maybe front end developers like do it a lot because it's easy to like add React and make a mess. But like I've seen, and we've seen plenty of people make a mess out of back end stuff, bringing in, I mean, we've talked to people, they're like, oh, I'm starting a startup and I'm making a Kinesis data lake thing and I'm using log storage and I'm doing, you know what I'm saying?
No,
it's
front
the
end, dude, you're exactly right. And framing it with like back end tech is a great way to like flip it. But front end gets picked on because you have to use tech X, and then 18 months later, oh, tech X is awful.
Yes,
you have
it's very trendy.
Y.
Yes, very trendy, moves very fast. So that is one conversation, and of course, people like you and I would agree. It would tell anybody, and we have told people in the last week, right, that if you are trying to build a profitable business, like in the next whatever, like, you should use established tech, right? There's Figmas who are literally trying, part of the business value, the product value is the bleeding edgeness of the tech itself. It's what being able to create an Adobe Illustrator in the browser enables, right? Yep. So, but that goes to the point of estimated product benefits and estimated costs, which is why I actually try to keep this out. And I had a good conversation with Ryan about this at the conference.
Wait, can you I don't
yes,
think I
can
fully
explain
understand
this.
that. So can
yes.
you? Yeah.
Yep. Because we both kind of like study kind of economics nerds, So it really goes to this estimates part. So this is how economists do thought experiments. They relax constraints until the problem is extremely simple, and then they start adding constraints. And as you add in the constraints, that tells you kind of what is happening. So, for example, maybe you start off learning about economics with Robinson Crusoe. It's a person on an island. They can fish they can collect one fish a day, and they need to eat one, and they can eat one fish a day, and then they go to sleep and they wake up and they do it again. And how does that person get out of like grinding poverty, right? Well, they have to go some days without eating fish because they have an idea for a net, right? So the person doesn't eat a fish for 2 days, 3 days, goes hungry, and he makes a net and he's successful. And now he can catch 2 fish a day. So this is the idea of an investment, right? And an investment is risky. So the person didn't know if it was going to pay off. There's other people elsewhere on the island who tried to make, a net out of leaves, and it didn't work. And either they were hungry or they died, right? But this guy made a net, and that's how like he increased that's technological capital. That's like the productivity of his labor has increased thanks to development of technology, right? And now he has 2 fish a day that he can catch. So what does that mean? Well, he can get fat and live lazy, or he meets somebody else, and now he can pay people because he has savings thanks to his increased productivity of labor. He can actually fund new investments. He can pay people to make more nets, right? So this is like the essence of entrepreneurship. An entrepreneur is someone who has to make a risky investment in expectation. Sorry, I'm like we're down the hole now. In expectation that they are going to create an arrangement of resources that's more productive for him and his fellow humans or whatever than they were in the prior configuration, right? And it's a risk. And it's a risk because if it fails, the person who made the net out of leaves, lost out. That would be equivalent of a modern day business going bankrupt. The configuration of resources, the product benefit, didn't exceed the cost of the inputs in their particular arrangement, right? So, but if they do, the business makes a profit. And this is why an entrepreneur is compensated, because they bear the risk. First of all, they have to secure investment for financing it, either through abstaining from consumption themselves, like the guy who doesn't eat a fish, or through convincing somebody else to borrow their savings. But all savings comes from some abstention of consumption at the end of the day. So there was always kind of like a sacrifice to generate savings somewhere in the economy. And an entrepreneur takes the savings and funds an investment, right? Finance an investment. Finance comes from the word to see through. It's a French word. It means to see through. So you have to see something through. And while you're seeing it through, you're not getting any revenue, right? You're not getting any benefit, and you test it out in the future. Anyways, the reason I talk about all this is because the slide from Ryan's talk that talked about product benefit and technical cost, this is the part where we're talking past each other sometimes in the last month on Twitter. The product benefit is not a known thing. It never is known. It is not known that Trello adding drag and drop to the UI was going to actually make it so much more useful. That Apple adding windows that drag, that iPhone adding a fluid gesture interface is going to make it useful. That Facebook adding a news feed when it first added, or liking a post. Whether you think of these product features as things like that, like I just mentioned, UI things, or you think of more like hardcore backend feature things, like now we have roles in the system. You can have an admin. The admin gets an email when they send something. All of these, like the features that make up software in service of user tasks and flow. This is a discovery process, right? Robinson Crusoe had to go through a discovery process, which fundamentally has uncertainty in it, to decide to know whether it was sticks or leaves that was going to help him catch more fish. So and this is why, like, when people say border radius doesn't matter for your app and you're a backend developer, and like you see a front end developer wasting all of his time animating something that doesn't need to be animated, and they're making a mess of your code to do it, and this is like just adding tech debt for no reason. Like these are the two conversations getting mashed together. Because for Apple, it did make sense for them to spend untold amounts of money and time to make a fluid gestural interface, which was like it's a really pretty version of border radius, but there's a feeling to iPhone that people really like and obviously has worked well for Apple. So there are times when there are like hardware features and business requirement, like constraint like things you can think of as traditionally more like this is just a feature, right? But that contribute to a product success, right? And I think that's where the backend folks are coming from. They're like, you're making like a B2B SaaS, and your customers don't care about a drop down being green colored instead of the browser default color or something like that, right? Or I don't care about an animation or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
So, whereas again, you have examples on the other side where like the UI does make a difference enough that people say, I'm going to use whatever, Trello, and I'm going to use Gmail. Gmail's like a great example, or like Google Calendar, right? Where you can think of, the whole point is that the product benefit is actually unknown. And the benefit of like hard features that you add to the back end it's not just better because you add them. We all know that software gets bloated, and a lot of companies go out of business because of bloat, of feature bloat. So product feature is not a hardly defined, the product benefit in his slide, it is not a crisply defined thing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is an estimate, it is a guess, it is a prediction in the mind, ultimately, of the entrepreneur, the owner of the business who's deciding how to allocate all the resources of the company as to how much this thing is going to benefit the users, the customers. And the cost is also an estimate because you don't know how much anything is going to cost. And ultimately, the only way you know if it's worth the investment is if your company makes money, because that means that people, the revenue is higher than the costs, and you have a positive profit.
I love that. I think the part where I'm getting hung up on is that in the situation you described, I think it is, if you have a team made of front end and back end engineers, and it's clear we want to build a rich interactive UI because we think this will give us an advantage in the market, and people will sign up. That is something that I think like the backend
it's not actually talked about.
Yes, exactly. The backend developers might say, well, I disagree, but like I'm going to follow because I'm like proud to work on software that looks great. And I'm going to provide as much back-end features to support the front-end folks with this. But that's not how I ever see this play out. I see it play out as we're building the B2B SaaS, we need to be able to update a record in a database, and then
the front-end people are like, you're stupid because you're not using React or something like that.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to pick on front-end or pick on back-end here, but the way I've seen this play out is like each team kind of goes off in their own silo, and they're not understanding why they're choosing the tech that they're choosing.
That's a good point.
Maybe this is a problem with like leadership, and maybe this is a problem where like this is where a really strong technical leader can come in and say, like UX is a core value because of that expectation.
I have a lot of thoughts here. I just finished giving 3 conference talks in 6 weeks, and now I've got like another one like that's basically 75% of the way formed.
Of course you do.
This is what the podcast is good for. So there's a couple things to unwrap in what you're saying. First of all is that, like you said, the product benefit versus the technical cost. Product benefit is not a monotonous thing. It is not a homogeneous blob, and there's just a benefit. Yes, there's ultimately a benefit to like a feature that shipped or an application that you make, and you can say like how much money that they paid for it. But benefit can also be thought of in a more kind of fuzzy way. And as you and I and everyone listening to this podcast knows, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat in software. And so when you say we have a benefit because we're going to be adding a news feed to Facebook for the first time, right? I'm trying to remember there. I was listening to this podcast. It was like going back in time to the news feed. But remember before it existed, it was like the first example of like a social feed.
I think on the latest All In, they were
All In. Yes. So we're going to add a news feed. That's a benefit, right? But like you said, ultimately, there's 1,000 million ways to make a news feed, right? Should it have more features and capabilities, or should it look better? Ultimately, you have to people. Even if you have strong leadership who communicates an ethos that focuses more on one or the other, we think like our users are going to benefit more from really a dense and like a high functionality UI with lots of different configuration, or we want something more lockdown, or we want something pretty. Even if you get clear communication from leadership, I mean, come on, think about it. Every developer at every level is making 1,000 decisions that's going to affect the output. So
Yeah, maybe I'm being too like picky and too like straw manny and like picking these
no,
examples. But
I don't think so. And I think like it also made me think of like the Tailwind folks. The Tailwind folks, Adam and Steve and everybody, all the stuff that they work on. There are plenty of people who in the kinds of details, the time and attention and resources that they give to the visual details would absolutely not be worth the cost to justify the benefit, the product benefit in many, many organizations, right? It's because they have a good understanding of what their customers value, and for them, it does outweigh it. I could talk about this for hours, but all this to say, in that part in Ryan's talk where it says the product benefit is greater than the cost, you build it. If it's not, you don't. There's a lot of fuzziness. There's a lot of estimation going on. So I think that leads to the benefit is not something that you can calculate. It's kind of a guess.
yeah,
If
yeah,
your
of course,
company is
yes.
making profit, then you're kind of guessing right, but you're always learning. The market is a process, like this. Israel Kirzner said. He has like a lot to say about how people don't understand this part of it, but it really is an ongoing process. And I think this even goes back to something you said at the beginning, which was like your boss asked for a change. And so, it's a process. It always goes on and always changes. And I don't think absolute statements from either side, either the back end people saying, stop learning, like we don't need border radius, you should just be doing something else, right? Because the sum of border radius and gradients and good typography could end up making something like a Tailwind that stands on its own and is known for its design, and that's part of it. That's part of its benefit, right?
I know, but
And
I just want to interject there. That's like not some. That's not the role of like a front end developer. When I hear back end developers complaining about front end developers, it's not
yes,
the front end
you're
developer to make that decision. That is like a product leadership
yes,
decision.
I agree with you. So maybe there's a third
Yeah.
conversation here that people are talking past, where people are trying to make decisions on the technical cost side to lower it for the sake of benefits that they have in their own mind, and it's not really their job to be estimating. And if people disagree about the benefits of a certain feature or a certain part of a feature, like the design or the front end or the back end, you can again. There's ways to flip all of this. The back end could be made a lot faster if you were to add uh, something like a cache, let's say. And let's say you could perfectly cache this app in the back end. And but it raises the cost side of that
Yeah.
equation
Yes. Yeah.
a ton. But the backend guy just does it because he's like, no, this is like really important. Like this thing took like 275 milliseconds. And I was like looking at, some profiler, and it said this was like one of our slowest things. So I'm going to make it cache, and it takes a lot longer, and it adds a lot of debt to the code base. And it totally wasn't worth it for the users. And if the boss or the owner knew how much time he had spent or she had spent doing this thing, they would have said 2 weeks of your time would have been so much better spent somewhere else. I can't believe you just wasted that. And maybe the front end people don't complain about it to the back because they don't even know what's going on back there. But I think
No.
you could have a front end
Great.
developer
Yes.
saying to the
Yes.
back end person, like, just give me some data. Like, you're telling me it took you a week to do this because of this extra reason, or right?
Yeah.
It's the same. It's absolutely the same thing. So yes, there's two parts here going on, which is one, are we like saying that we're trying to lower technical cost when we are actually we are actually smuggling in our opinions about the product benefit in instead. And the reason the technical cost is going up is not because we picked the right tool for the job, but because we're smuggling in our own values in a way that's not aligned with the organization or the leadership or what our actual users care about. I think that's like the back end side of the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the back end folks in the conversation on Twitter we're talking about. I think the other side is that sometimes, and this is if you get away from the engineers, there are sometimes benefits that are hard to understand, and benefits that aren't just like, again, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, and it's up to the entrepreneur to make a bet to finance an investment in something that could be new. All of that to say, Ryan was talking narrowly, and this is why at the beginning of this conversation, I said, let's remove the expected part of both of these sides, because really this equation is way more complicated than product benefit is greater than technical cost. You do it, otherwise you don't. It's really expected product benefit, which is basically what we've been talking about here, and expected product cost.
Yep.
And that is the job of the entrepreneur and the business, the people who own the resources, right? If I hire you and I pay you a fish a day to come work for me, I get to tell you what to do. That's the contract, right? So Ryan's talk was not about anything what we just talked about, but it is. I'm glad that we kind of picked it apart, because I do think that's where it gets
focus
lost.
on the thing. Yeah,
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So everything we just talked about is not what the rest of the talk is about. The rest of the talk is about, let's just take for a given benefit of a feature. And again, a feature is comprised of tons of little features. So let's just focus on the border radius. If we can lower the technical cost, all else equal, that's a good thing.
So we're assuming there is a
Yes.
benefit. Like we're not.
Yes.
We're just
The benefit is 10, and the cost right now is 20. And
so how do we get
through
it
a
down to
technical
9?
innovation, we can make it basically 1 or 0.
Okay, cool.
That's the conversation. And
Wait, hold on. Can I ask a
yes.
question? And is it how do we get from 20 to 1 or 0? Is it the road that gets us there? Or
right. So that is just the setup, right?
Okay.
That's just the setup. And again, what you said is like the border radius could be more beneficial. None of that expectations about what the benefit of this thing is or any feature is what it's about. It's just for a given benefit, all else equal, we want to lower the technical cost, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really what abstractions are about, if you think about it. Technical abstractions and things like frameworks. Like DHH is doing exactly the same thing. The reason, he talks about this conceptual compression, right? Rails doesn't tell you what the benefit of a thing is that you're building. It doesn't have anything to say about that. That's the job of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is making a guess, a prediction, an expectation that this piece of software is going to make me more money and be more valuable to people than all the resources it took for me to make it. Rails has nothing to say about where you should put a button or what the button should do or what the screen should look like or how much features your app should have. It has nothing to say about the benefit. The benefit side is all the business side. That is the entrepreneur's role in the whole thing. And this is not just software. This is everything in an economy. Everything. Is a house worth more than the labor and materials that was used to build it? How do you know? Did they make money on the house? That's their answer right there. So it goes all the way down. So maybe we've gotten to an easier way to like stop the two debates from crossing into each other's, like stepping in on each other's toes, because this conversation is not about the benefit at all. For a given benefit, all else equal, a lower cost would be good, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so what is Rails doing? DHH is doing conceptual compression. You want to make Basecamp, if you could make it today versus 10 years ago, the benefit's the same. Let's just freeze the world. But now you have Rails from today as opposed to Rails from 10 years ago and all the tech we have. That's going to be a lot easier, right? The cost has come down a ton, both from the abstractions in the code base and from services on the infrastructure, right?
Yeah, people have
So
made more nets
yeah,
in the last
yes,
10 years.
exactly,
And
exactly. We have way more savings. We have better nets, and so the cost of like going on vacation for a week now is going to take you 1 day of fishing as opposed to 10 to save up enough fish, right? To go on vacation for a week or to do something for someone you love or whatever. You know what I mean? Again, it's not about the benefit. The cost, the tech side is about the cost side, right? So that's what he's trying to focus on. He's saying that's what we're all doing. That's what Taylor's doing with Laravel. That's what DHH is doing with Rails. That's what Sebastian's doing with React. That's what everyone on the framework level. We are not telling people what to make or what kind of product to make or whether this interaction should be fast or slow or what. It has nothing to do with the benefit at all. What the framework people are trying to do is trying to lower the cost for a given product, for a given benefit, for a given feature. All else equal, right? Ceteris paribus is the economist way of saying this. You're building X 10 years ago. Hopefully it was harder. And if you, or, all else equal, we can make it cheaper so that the cost goes down. That's what this conversation's about. And that's what the border radius example is all about. It has nothing to say.
because
He's
it
not
doesn't
making
say anything.
yes.
If you add border radiuses,
Yes.
you'll
You're not going to make
reduce
money.
churn by 10%.
Yeah, exactly.
It has nothing to say about that.
Exactly. Exactly. It is all about the technical cost side of the equation. And going back to what you said, 30 minutes ago, we could hopefully all agree that border radius being a feature in CSS is better, all else equal, right? I'm not saying it's better because apps are going to be more beautiful and beautiful apps make more money, right?
Yeah,
It
it's
has
better
nothing
because
to
it
do.
lowers the cost.
It
Yeah.
costs.
Okay, this is great.
Exactly.
Also, too, dude, I did not understand. It's very easy to hear this side of the cost argument and then have like your
Yes.
lizard brain switch over to, well, I don't want that, like I don't want to pay the price of finding
Right.
that cost reduction. And so then you quickly get back to
Right,
focusing on the
right,
product
right,
benefit,
right.
which is
Right.
what
Yes.
why we did that whole detour to
Yes,
get off.
exactly.
Okay, awesome.
To
Thank you.
disentangle them. Yep, that's good summary. And right, all this converse again. All else equal concept is important here. All else equal is important. It's not that the cost is lower and that's going to change what we build or it's going to change what we think is matters to users. Right? It's not about that. It's just the cost side. Right? And so just to like your earlier point about the front end person saying, oh, it's so easy to do this now, so we should spend all this time in getting React or like add radius everywhere or whatever, the equivalent of the back end person saying that. It's just the cost side. Okay, so that was his setup, and that's kind of like where my mind went when he said all this, right? And he had talked about the network, and then the example that I said at the beginning of this episode, where to make the table sortable is the feature, the product in this case, right? You make a table, you build it, you're done. Now, a week later, your boss says, let's make the table sortable, right? And your boss is the one who's estimating the benefit, right? They could be right. They could be wrong. Even if the cost was zero, it could make the product worse. Because the feature is making it confusing or they didn't expect to do it. It's a bad feature, right? That's your boss's job. That's the entrepreneur's, ultimately the owner's decision to make, right? Now, the owner has estimated the benefit of this, and they might have some idea of what it costs to build, right? They come to you and they tell you to make a sortable table. This is also why this conversation gets difficult, right? Because if your boss comes and tells you all of our customers want a sortable table, they're probably coming with some expectation of what it's going to cost in their mind. But there's probably a threshold where if it took a year, they're going to say, never mind. Because they're estimating the product benefit and they have to have some notion of the cost to know whether it's going to be profitable or not. And so they come to you, and this is basically Ryan's point, right? like you said, you have to make a lot of decisions. So you try to make those decisions in your mind. Are we going to expose an API endpoint and get React in here? Is the sortable table something that we only need something like Alpine or HTMX for? It's going to be plenty high enough ceiling here. And of course, the more experienced you are, you're going to be thinking, well, what happens if he comes back next week? And right? So there's lots of estimation going on in your mind about the cost of this thing. And you're trying to be a good engineer and a good employee and help them make the best decision about the best way, again, to skin this cat. And Ryan's point was that this is just a thought experiment. It's thought provoking to think, what if the only cost is use client, and that you can write that and all of the other things that were clouding your mind and making you choose between a lower cost tech like HTMX or an Alpine that's going to maybe have some ceiling that's relevant, but maybe not. And now I'm making a guess about that versus investing in something that might be more flexible, but it's going to take me longer to get it. So what if the cost was literally just use client?
Cool.
And
you know what I just realized when you were explaining that? Border radius is great, but border radius, we kind of had one way to do it, right? With like the tables and the GIFs. And it's you can hold that all in your head.
Yeah.
So it's like, I just don't want to do it because it's going to take me a couple hours and it's not worth the benefit. Again, getting back to the benefit, which I should avoid. But this is actually the table thing it's much harder. Which tech do I use? Like you're making massive decisions. HTMX versus React, inertia. There are just so many decisions you have to make.
Yeah. And he tried to call out that with the border radius thing where there are unknowns. So you think it's just copying this messy thing. So the cost is like a messy code base and like having to like create like the hours you were saying of like creating the GIFs in the corners. But then there's unknown things too where like you have nested corners or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so there's unknown cost there that you're trying to estimate. Maybe, but I agree with you. I think it's like an example that really highlights like how multifactorial like any decision like this is when you have to step out of your current paradigm. All that to say, border radius had a drastic effect on the cost of those things, and you can just lump in lots of modern CSS things. And we spend a lot less time doing those things than we do. And it's actually a great point because these days you see a lot of design sites that don't communicate anything and they're flashy because of the capabilities. So again, this is not a statement about the cost going down to zero, like being an important driver of like value or utility or like good software. That's not even what it's about. Because someone could argue like, well, now it's easy.
Worse. Yeah.
It's worse. Someone could argue like it's the average app is worse because it's so easy to build all this sort of stuff. But the point that he's making and what framework authors are doing is all else equal. That is the goal of everything that all these people are doing is reducing the cost of a given feature, which says nothing about the benefit it has or whatever. So
this is awesome. This is really awesome. And tying it back to use client, why does this exist? It's not that building rich interactive client components is going to make your business take off. It's that
definitely
you can lower the cost, and so it's easier.
And
to
he
experiment.
yes,
really good,
exactly.
I think I just got it. Like, sorry, it took
I
me
love
an
it,
hour
man.
to get there, but I think I just got it. And wow, that is something.
Nice. It was amazing. No, I mean I tweeted out right. I was like I thought it was the best, like one of my favorite React talks I've ever seen in the way it pulled on all these ideas together. And he even said that like most of the React apps of the last 10 years like probably should have been Rails apps or Laravel apps, right? And obviously he's like exaggerating to make a point. But his point was that, yeah, maybe a lot of us do get seduced by new technology and the kinds of things you can do. And this is again to kind of like the server folks point is like you're seduced because it's like a creative outlet and you like the craft of coding and like you want to be proud of something, but like if your customers don't care and you confuse that benefit for customer benefit, then you're going down the wrong path completely. And if this technology is so seductive that you get you go down that path over and over again and make stuff that's like not good, like, and you're wasting all this time for this UI stuff. When if you just use battle tested tech, you would have been able to more clearly evaluate the benefits of a given feature you're building. So that's a whole other side of the argument, right?
Right.
But to his point, to what you were just saying about how you like understand, he's really talking about the cost here and not about the benefit side. He even said that, yeah, a lot of React apps using tech that I've written would have been better as, a Rails app because people do get excited about whatever. People maybe get excited, whatever, about what you can do and not whether you should do it, right? And that's kind of what this is a good tee up for my talk, which we will cover next week, because the high floor that these UI frameworks enabled us to get came with a cost that high ceiling that these high ceilings that the front end frameworks gave us for the people who were building those rich UIs, some of which made sense to do, some of which didn't. We lost the floor out from under us, and so what is the should have just been Rails apps part of the equation refer to, right? Because he was talking about a lot of people that had made apps using tools that he had made, right? So on the one hand, he's saying him and all the framework and tool authors are making tools to lower the cost. And we just agreed that all else equal,
you should lower the cost.
You should lower the cost. And now he's sitting there saying most of the JavaScript apps should have been Rails apps. And why is that? It's because the technical cost of building the whole feature, right? Maybe the sortable table, the cost went down if you use something like React. But what about delivering the whole experience? The whole cost actually went up for a lot of these cases. Skyrocketed, right? Skyrocketed. And people are doing it for the sake of one little part of it. But it turns out the technical cost is actually not. It's not something that just goes down over time, Like we don't like in the case where like Robinson Crusoe makes the net, and then he makes like a bigger net, and he makes a net out of like carbon fiber.
It's a fun net factory.
Yeah. Yes. No. But again, there's a lot of people who made nets that broke, and it wasn't worth it, right? It only caught half a fish, or the net broke, and so you just wasted all of this investment, and So there's a question here about the total cost for building everything, and that's kind of what my talk was about. Where yes, an SPA makes it easier to something with JavaScript memory makes it easier to like a tweet and show you immediately. Should you make that happen? You don't know, but let's say you need it. Let's say that there's a benefit for it. So all else equal, if you're using an SPA, you get that easier. Something with JavaScript memory. But what about actually making the whole thing, right? And if you have to go to one of these front-end frameworks in order to enable a realistic cost for building the front side of the features of your app, it better be worth it. And a lot of people are wrong about that. And people get confused about the benefits because of what they care about instead of their customers. So there's a lot to untangle here, but
Dude,
that was a lot of fun.
That was an amazing summary, and it made me think that the next time I'm talking to a backend developer or being middleman between backend and front end developer, the real question is, do you think the UI is bad? Like, do you think it's bad? Like the person complaining about React, we'll just say that. Do you think it's bad that like we have animations and open modals and like there's just a lot on the screen? Is that what's bad, or is what's bad that the code base got deady in order to do it,
Right.
or it's harder to understand the code base. It's now in
Right.
two different languages.
The
or
back end people can't make changes to the front end and vice
Can't make
versa.
data-
The front end
ex-
people can't make database changes. Yeah.
Right. And then so like untangling those two, which
Yep.
everything you just explained helped me understand.
Yep.
And then from there you can talk about it's not a benefit conversation, it's a cost
Right.
conversation.
Right.
By the way, I'm
Right.
I'm making like a
Right.
massive
Yes.
assumption here, but you kind of showed me every single time I've had this conversation, it's never about the benefit, it's always about the cost. With developers, with entrepreneurs, it's different. But with developers,
Yes. Exactly. Yep. There's a lot like I'm still
I
thinking
know.
about right now. I was just thinking about like the back end person at this like meetup one time, and he was making a startup, and he was using all this tech, and it's like the reality is the cost is really complicated too, right? The cost is kind of like the cost involves time as well and uncertainty, and there might be and that's kind of more of what my talk was about, was like, do you hit a ceiling, right? And do you want to spend more time because you're going to have to like bail out, or you can't build that feature that turned out to be something that your customers wanted, and your boss is upset because you used tech that had a ceiling or whatever, right? And they're like, you don't spend time on the type. You work for Tailwind, and you don't spend time on the typography or something like. And it's like, no, that's like what your job is. So you need to use you need to use tools that let you do that, or whatever it is, right? But the cost side also involves estimation on the part of the engineers, right, and the team and the employees. The benefit is really estimated by the owner. The cost involves a lot of trade-offs and guessing, and it also changes over time. So you could make something that's cheaper today, but ends up being more costly, or you could do something like this guy has reminding me of from this meetup, where he's using Kinesis, log, drain, whatever, just for like a CRUD app, and he's like, no, we're gonna need this, man. Like, we're gonna need this, And that's when you're like rolling your eyes, because you feel like on the technical side they're not using the right tool for the job, and it's very unlikely on the entrepreneurial side that the benefit that users are going to care about any of that. And that was like, Ian's point on Twitter about the drop down, and other folks talking about these UI things. Ryan's point is not about that. Ryan's point is about we should have border radius, whether or not a company ought to use it. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So.
Dude, that is a really hard argument to make, just because it is so easy for the person you're arguing against to get off track.
Right.
And
yes,
it's just, especially, everyone has their tribe.
Yeah.
Twitter.
Social media encourages, right? Thunderdome.
Yeah. Dude, awesome. That was fast. That was
cool.
fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, man. That was fun. Awesome. Let's wrap it up. I'll talk about my talk next week. I think they've published standalone published Ryan's talk. Mine's still in live stream, I think, but maybe we'll have it ready for next week. But otherwise, that's it. We love to hear questions from y'all. Hit us up on Frontend First FM. You can also send us an email to support@buildui.com. We should get an email. I want like an email bag for Frontend First, and I want like phone calls, I want to be like Dave Ramsey and just like go through phone calls. That would be awesome. But I think we should set up an email for it so people can email us questions, because not everyone's on Twitter. You know what I mean?
I think email would be great. Phone would be awesome too.
Yep, phone would be really cool to have part of the, because I'm making a little web page on builddry.com that has a website, and it has a Front End First website where it's going to have our podcast episodes, and it'd be cool to just be able to let people leave messages there, emails, or even phone calls. So
that would be awesome to do. Drop a little message. We can do a little
play back the voice
recording and stuff, like right in the browser, because those APIs I think are pretty good now.
Yep, I was talking to Kent, and he has that on his website. He has like a call Kent thing, and you just like press record, and he plays it back. Yeah, yep, pretty neat, right?
Super cool.
Yeah, I would like that. It'd be fun to have like questions at the end of each episode. But anyways, thanks for listening. That's it for this week, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
All right, bye.